Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all on Sunday. That's a good thing in our event today. The title of the event is "The Nature of Trouble and the Case for Hope." This event is sponsored by two organizations. The first one is Humanist, Halton Humanist Community, with HPHC, and Ensaneyoun, North America. Ensaneyoun is the Arabic translation of humanist again. So before we start introducing our guest speaker, I would like to get George Kardahi. He's a VP for HPHC to say a few words about the organization.
Thank you, Mohammed. To the few of you who don't know me, my name is George Kordahi. I am the Vice President of the Halton Humanist Community, or HPHC for short. I'm also a member of Ensaneyoun North America. I'm one of its earliest members and a former officer on its board. HPHC began in 2008 as the Oakville Humanist Community and later became the Halton Humanist Community. I joined in 2014. Since then, we've hosted many events with interesting and informative speakers. Via Zoom, we welcomed Rabab Kamal from Egypt, whom many of you know, and Afghan feminist journalist Zahra Nader. In person, we've hosted Jonathan Kay, Professor Christopher DiCarlo, Professor Larry Moran, as well as Ali Rizvi and Sharif Ibrahim, who are with us here today, and many, many more. In my brief time, I want to tell you why I think joint meetings between our two organizations are important. I believe HPHC and Ensaneyoun share common values and hopes, though sometimes our concerns differ. Those differences come from who we are. While HPHC reflects the concerns of humanists in our wider community, Ensaneyoun reflects the experiences of secular immigrants from Arab or Arabic-speaking countries, whose issues may not always be fully understood or appreciated by the wider community. I immigrated from Egypt 57 years ago, so I feel I straddle both of these communities. That's why I believe it's important for both communities to know each other better. Now I'd like to invite George Botros to say a few words on behalf of Ensaneyoun.
Welcome, everyone. I'm George Botros, member of Ensaneyoun, former board member and one of the founding members. The idea of Ensaneyoun came when we felt the need for a platform for our community, mainly from Arabic-speaking background, to have a friendly environment for opinion exchange and free speech, where every opinion is heard and every member guest is welcomed. The idea came when we noticed that a lot of similar organizations within the community coming from Arabic-speaking background was either affiliated or sponsored by religious or political entities. Such affiliation implicated a concern about how free and how independent the associations could be. I invite you to check our website, our social media pages, and check our podcast on our YouTube channel. Thank you.
Okay, now to the introduction. We live in uncertain times, or I would say rather in turmoil. Natural disasters and man-made disasters. Natural disaster we have seen in TV lots of floods, landslides in Pakistan, Sudan, hurricanes in US, earthquakes in Turkey and Afghanistan, to name a few. The man-made is worse, actually, than the natural one. The man-made disasters is wars. We can see everywhere now. Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, Russia, and Ukraine, and with millions and millions of people displaced from their homes and became refugees in a matter of days. There's civil wars also in Yemen, civil war in Myanmar, and more refugees are getting out of these countries too. In this time, the big phenomena now is the concentration of wealth within the countries and also around the globe. The concentration of wealth, just to understand how severe it is, the first 20 billionaires in US, the total wealth, the sum of their wealth is equal or more than the GDP of all Africa. Not a single country, but all Africa. 20 people have the wealth of all Africa. That polarization, or that also reflected in political turmoil and political polarization. We can see that everywhere now, not only in one country, but in Europe. We can see that in US. See that in Canada now. It started to show. We are seeing also the rise of the far right and the sentiment, hatred against immigrant and against refugees because of the sheer number of these immigrants and refugees coming from third world countries. So people everywhere are feeling a little bit desperate and uncertain about their future and the future of their kids and their grandkids. That's why I invited my Dr. Egan to tell us today about hope. And I just want to let you know, I started, Dr. Michael Egan is an associate professor of history at McMaster University and also the director of Sustainable Future History Project at the same university, and the author of a book called Barry Commoner and the Source of Survival, Science of Survival, sorry. He taught many courses. I will choose some of them: The Age of Terror, A History of Terrorism in Modern World, Science and Technology in World History, The History of the Future, A History of Monsters. And I had the privilege to attend all these 4 courses with him, because as a senior person over 65, I had to get it for free. So, and actually I really liked it from the first one. The first one was the History of the Future, because I got some courses at U of T, University of Toronto, and this, I call it the classical way of this has happened in this year, this guy, and you get examined about your knowledge, how to memorize. With Dr. Egan, that was not the case. He gave lots of leverage to the students to write their thoughts and explore different ideas. That's why I really enjoyed those 4 courses with him. After that, we get into a good friendship. We started a small book club, Dr. Egan, myself, and another, he was a dean of civil engineering at McMaster too, Professor Art. And the first book that Dr. Egan suggested for us was Humankind, a hopeful history. And it really, for a guy coming from the Middle East, an area of constant turmoil or eternal turmoil, it gave me a little bit a glimpse of hope. So hopefully today we can listen to Dr. Egan and come out of here with a little bit of hope about the future. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Michael Egan.
Steal that mic as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we don't want to hear this. Can you hear me okay? I'm a hand talker, so if this happens, I apologize ahead of time. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for inviting me. When Mohammed proposed this, there might be about a half a dozen people that I can't say no to, and Mohammed is very definitely on that list. So I'm delighted to be here. And after that very generous introduction, I need to apologize ahead of time. I don't know that I have any coherent thoughts, and I certainly can't offer a clear pathway to hope. In a world as patently absurd as the one we seem to be inhabiting right now, it's very difficult to imagine clear pathways. But more to the point, I'm acquiring a virulent distrust of certainty and confidence. So I would propose that we continue to be wary. One of the signals, one of the voices I find myself coming back to more and more as I think about sort of the state of the current world is the French philosopher Albert Camus, who immediately after World War II, in 1946, he was part of a French contingency that came to the United States, a French cultural mission, while France was still undergoing, really only just beginning Reconstruction, to talk about the war experience in Europe and the war experience in France in particular. And it was almost exactly, hold on, I'm doing them 80 years ago, 80? 46, yeah. Sound right? Yeah, 79. So next year will be 80 years. Gave a talk at Columbia University in New York called The Human Crisis. And he finished this talk with a clarion call I share with students all the time. And it's one of those sort of get me out of bed and starting the day in the right direction. After talking about the chaos, the violence, the absurdity of World War II, he finished with what he saw as his mission statement for the generation of young French people who were coming out of the chaos of war. Because the world is unhappy, we have to create joy. Because it is unjust, we are the ones who have to create justice. And because the world is absurd, we have to give it all its meaning. So I think on some level, that last bit, that the world is absurd, but we still have to give it a little meaning, is maybe my mission for this afternoon, is to propose some pathways, some directions, and some reflections on what that hope might look like. Now, I should say two things. First of all, I'm not sure I believe anything I'm about to say. And I'm not saying it because I think it's smart or because I want to change your mind. It's more about change your mind about anything. I'm trying to ease my mind about everything. So I'm glad for the bully pulpit of a microphone. Before I talk about hope, though, it seems to me, I'm an historian, so it seems to me on some level my job is to reflect on how did we get to here? How is this the environment that we're navigating, and where do we look for hope within that? And I want to propose that we are currently ensconced in a global civil war. And Mohammed and I were chatting over text last week. And where did we miss the signs? I think that there's a degree of sort of, I don't want to say surprise, because I think the clues were there, but for those of us who have been citizens of the world for the last 50 years or so, what clues might we have seen or might we have missed along the way? And I want to sort of map out some of that historical narrative before sort of shifting towards thinking a little bit about hope and what hope might look like. Well, From the vantage point of 2025, I think it's possible to suggest that we're living in the middle of this global civil war. It's not a binary nation-state belligerence in the way that certainly the 20th century and 19th century conflicts were typically framed. I think the contours are multifarious and they're complex. And so are its causes, the causes of these kinds of conflicts. Colonialisms and the unequal distribution of global wealth have divided the world into powerful and subservient, not just countries, but within states as well. The banks that were enriched from the original European voyages of discovery, maybe conquest is the better term, those voyages were funded by banks that then took much of that revenue and have supported both sides of every war since the French Revolution forward. The current climate emergency and environmental crisis are causing disastrous scarcities, further impoverishing the world's most vulnerable. And that's also then driving new and unprecedented migration patterns, the likes of which no country has a policy for. We can grant people asylum. There is no such, as recently as 5 and 10 years ago, no country had a policy for environmental refugees. There was no way to grant them asylum in any traditional sense along the lines of political. And we're seeing upwards of 250 million people will be forced into these kinds of environmental migrations by the middle of this century. Those migration patterns and those economic uncertainties are driving new forms of xenophobia and renewed appeal for various forms of fortress societies and the enclosing of boundaries and indeed the building of walls. The neoliberal conquest of markets has transformed economies and labor in dramatic ways. And the internet, which I think was designed to connect us and free information for everyone in a utopian democratic commons, has had the opposite effect. And my instinct is AI has promised exactly the same things, and we'll see where that goes. My instinct is nowhere good. So we're up against it a little bit. And driving these driving all this, we're seeing more conflicts, we're seeing more genocides, more terrorism, and more ressentiment, a resentment towards others, and divisions, different kinds of divisions between haves and have-nots, access to power and disenfranchisement of power, and so on. I've got 2 or 3 sort of key moments in terms of sort of places that we might look to for signs of where this world sort of manifested. And the first one would be the economic crisis, the most recent one around 2008. After which progressive forces failed to present an effective, liberating, emancipatory narrative. Neoliberalism's entrenchment was part of that, but there was also, I think, a lack of an imagination and a lack of execution in traditional notions of the progressive and left and liberal corners. I don't know that history necessarily repeats itself. As an historian, I need to resist the notion that I can just repeat the same story over and over again, but 2008 feels an awful lot like 1929. In retrospect. After the left failed, discontent grew, making room for populist strongmen promises of order and restoration of new forms of national ethoses. To make America great again was not a brand new novel phenomenon in the last 10 or 15 years. It goes back to the 1920s and the 1930s, and powerfully similar rhetoric to many states around Europe, for sure. So maybe this is actually more of a rebirth than a restoration. It can be sort of imagined around the better rhetorical framing, especially since much of it is drenched in masculine and patriarchal tones that foster new forms of misogyny and gender violence as well. And within all this, the rebirth of a nation and its protectionist tones highlights order and righteousness in ways that exacerbate racism and xenophobia. So we're living in an angry moment, we're inhabiting, and not just out there and on the news, but very much in here and in our own communities as well. And I want to raise 2 things. First, this isn't an us and them, and I'm not trying to sort of suggest vitriol because my side, and I associate myself with a more progressive, a more inclusive, a more embracing of a sort of a pacifist dignity, which is where my politics turn towards, is losing. That's not the complaint I'm making here. I think traditional liberalism feels more than a little morally and intellectually bankrupt when it comes to trying to keep the tentpoles of what constituted its traditional identity. An adherence to a neoliberal project championed by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and Barack Obama, among others, when real jobs, which is quite different from wealth, were diminishing. We have sort of the beginnings of this neoliberal tension taking place, not just with bad guys, but with the good guys. And that's not a black and white, and it's not a white hat, black hat kind of analogy I want to make, but progressives, as we've understood them, centrists and conservatives have both embraced this particular kind of economic model, which is geared around letting the market dictate itself as much as possible. And when that happens, thank you. That's what I wanted. That in itself, I think, has created a global market that has put a premium on wealth and acquisition and growth as distinct from people and communities and sense of self. So that's the first point. It's not because I am not a neoliberalist that I am concerned about this, but rather that these are complex factors. And the second one, and this is the historian in me speaking, is I don't think any of this was inevitable. I don't believe in sort of the waves of history sort of taking over here either. And I'll talk about hope in more detail in a little bit, but I want to resist the temptation of resigning myself to the supposition that the human race is inherently flawed, that we're predisposed to self-interest, to competition, and to conflict. And this goes back to Rutger Bregman's book, Humankind, which, if you haven't read it, I recommend it highly. And I should have checked whether the Mississauga Library has it. They should. It's a wonderful book that I think pushes back against this notion that we're all sort of competitive and only interested in ourselves. And the human race, the identity of humanity is one that is violent and competitive. And it's this beautiful history that counteracts and sort of challenges the moments or the examples we use to sort of suggest that we are constantly in competition with each other, and finds examples in their place that suggest that we're actually cooperative. We tend toward kindness. We tend toward supporting our neighbors, but strangers around us as well. And I think if there's hope to be found, I think part of it needs to come from that notion that we need to rethink what we are not just as a society or in our respective cultures, but as a species as well. And that's not teeth-bearing suffering of others so that we can benefit. We are actually quite removed from that. Is Rutger Bregman's book. I'm not going to question or challenge the book one way or the other, but I need him to be right. I need to believe that there is a sense of kindness that is the essence of humanity. And maybe that makes me a congenital optimist. I don't know. I'll come back to hope. But the historian in me needs to assert that it didn't need to be this way. And maybe we should take a moment to reflect on why it is this way. I've just finished writing a book. I've just sent off the copy edits for a new book called Toxic Fear that looks at American cultural fear around pollution and pesticides and chemicals in the United States during the 1980s. And what was fascinating to me, this is the first time I'd sort of worked on a project on a history that I had lived through. I remember the 1980s, and it was really interesting to sort of compare my memories with what I was reading and what I was seeing, and going back and looking at primary sources and living in the 1980s. And finishing that book and sending it off has had me spending the last several months sort of thinking about, well, what happened next in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, I was a university student. I got married in the 1990s. My two older children were born in the 1990s. And that period between the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and 9/11, I don't remember. And I don't think that's just my own sort of personal fog from my own experiences and things like that. But it's had me starting to think about writing an essay called I Missed the 1990s. And I want to suggest that in terms of the time periods that we're sort of thinking about, and in terms of looking for moments that sort of suggest how we got to where we are now, increasingly, the more I've been thinking about this, I think the 1990s are actually is a decade that maybe it's time for us to give a little bit more care and thought to. So my question is, I started with this, did we miss the signs? Did this world sort of catch us a little bit by surprise? And did we miss the signs of our current troubles? Francis Fukuyama, for example, very famously, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, championed the end of history. In the absence of this traditional sort of epic tension between the West's democracy and capitalism and Soviet communism and authoritarianism, the West had won. And this was the end of history and the end of conflict in history. Which would have been bad for me because that's when I started looking for a job. So I'm glad history didn't end. He was wrong. But this was a decade for Fukuyama, but for many, who that was characterized by a surge in globalization and the collapse of a bipolar world order. And that had a series of effects. And I could sort of give you a list of all the things I didn't miss. I was there and I remember them. But in terms of sort of thinking about a decade and the identity of a decade, I really didn't and hadn't given it any thought. But I want to suggest that the 1990s produced sort of three consequences or three themes that we could think about. The first is the proliferation of internal conflicts. The second is the rise of globalized non-state threats. And then thirdly, the consequences of the collapse of this Cold War and the unipolarity that resulted in the globalization that subsequently ensued. The first part, though, internal conflicts, I think is tremendously important. This is a shift from interstate to intrastate, internal conflicts. Think about the Balkan Wars, for example, that ran through much of the 1990s, the Rwandan genocide, and the series of complex conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Congo Wars, which were not traditional wars in the 20th century or the 19th century notion or understanding of belligerent states between sovereign nations, but brutal struggles driven by ethnic, religious, and political fractures within the states themselves. So we missed, to a certain extent, the severity or the importance then of this primary threat to global security, which was not a clash of the superpowers, but the internal collapse of weak states, which could destabilize entire regions and necessitate humanitarian and military intervention, a pattern, of course, that intensified after 9/11. So the term ethnic cleansing entered the global lexicon and demonstrated that identity politics could be weaponized with horrific results. In addition to that, then, we have the rise of globalized non-state threats. 9/11, of course, I sort of used as sort of the end of the 1990s as sort of the catastrophic wake-up call. But the decade included a clear emergence of non-state actors capable of mass violence. 9/11 wasn't the first attack on the World Trade Center, for example. The first bombing in 1993 was an early but unsuccessful attempt by Islamist extremists to destroy the towers. And not just external threats to the United States, but internal ones with the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which was a massive act of domestic terrorism by anti-government extremists within the United States. Incidentally, and this blows my mind, Ramzi Ahmed Youssef, the globalized mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, and Timothy McVeigh, who orchestrated the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, found themselves in adjacent cells in a supermax prison awaiting trial. Youssef said after McVeigh's execution, and I'm quoting here, "I've never known anyone in my life who was so similar a personality to my own as his." And I'm coming back to this idea in due course. In addition, the rise of Al-Qaeda, of course, through the 1990s, the group responsible for 9/11 was active throughout this period, notably bombing US embassies in East Africa in 1998, and the USS Cole in 2000. So again, in terms of missing signs, the world was generally focused on state-level threats or managing the new economic order. The nature of asymmetric warfare and the power of dispersed, ideologically driven terror networks were severely underestimated until the turn of the millennium. I think certainly, and I don't mean to disparage intelligence organizations and agencies around the world, but in terms of popular culture and our popular reception, these were episodes until 9/11 hit, at which point there was the beginnings of thinking about a particular kind of pattern, but not fully understanding the extent to which these non-state threats, and we can bring this forward and think about ISIS and other organizations around the world, having a great deal more, a much broader and subterranean networks that have provoked and promoted a certain degree of widespread fear. The third, again, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and this unipolarity and globalization left a single dominant superpower in a period sometimes called unipolarity. This led to an emphasis on global economic integration and expansion of democracy, but simultaneously created deep resentments and instabilities. And I would also submit, and I don't mean to suggest the world was better when the Cold War was happening and the prospect of nuclear annihilation was all we had to worry about, but in new forms of disequilibrium that I don't think anybody quite had time to make sense of, understand, or try to restabilize. We can talk a little bit about globalization's backlash and this economic integration through agreements like, as it might be, NAFTA, and the establishment of the World Trade Organization fueled economic growth, but also increased inequality and left many populations feeling marginalized or exploited as key drivers of contemporary populism and nationalism. When people get left out, and I wanted to come back to this idea, the people at the margins who are left outside of the enfranchisement, the new forms of wealth, the new forms of economy, the new forms of marketplace, feel themselves having completely uprooted, disrooted, and unsure of where they belong. And I think there is a running pattern the world over on groups being able to prey on precisely this kind of uncertainty, this kind of fear among particularly, but not exclusively, young men. I think there's a degree of intervention fatigue that's taken over as well. That the subtle genius of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War made sure that we policed our friends and neighbors, our allies, a little bit more carefully. But in the absence of the United States having the Soviet Union as a bulwark, the United States became the world's policeman in new kinds of ways. And I think failures to prevent the Rwandan genocide and the prolonged nature of the Balkan conflicts exposed the limits and inconsistencies of a unipolar world's willingness to intervene, potentially emboldening future aggressors. So to sum up, the 1990s, which I know not enough about, but I think that there might be a project here that I'm sort of trying to park away here and not get carried away with now. I think the 1990s witnessed the unleashing of long suppressed ethnic, religious, and national tensions. Long suppressed, they were there. They didn't emerge. They weren't born in the 1990s, but the 1990s gave them room to incubate and percolate and grow. And this was coupled with a new vulnerability to non-state networked violence facilitated by emerging globalization and technology. So maybe these are missed signs, and I don't mean to suggest, I'm not coming here to say, you missed the 1990s, I missed the 1990s, our political leaders missed the 1990s, but I think with the benefit of hindsight, and that's what the historian's great privilege is to be able to sort of go back and think, oh, wait a minute, this is something we maybe should study more. If we want to make more sense of where we are now, the 1990s might be a decade that we ought to spend a little bit more time thinking about. But not all of the roots of this contemporary global civil war I was talking about manifested themselves in the 1990s. I think that's a little too tidy, it's a little too easy, it's a little too facile. If the 1990s suggested a shift in the world order, maybe we'd do well to use that new worldview to look further back in time. And one of the books I keep coming back to, did we read Mohammed Pankaj Mishra's The Age of Anger?
Yeah,
Pankaj Mishra, I want to say it was published in 2017. He's written a couple of books since that are also profoundly good. He's one of my intellectual superheroes at the moment, not because I agree with everything he says, but because he's able to take everything and draw in ideas and intellectual premises and economic and political theories from all over the world. And he has this felicity in putting a mirror up to the West and having the West look at itself in the mirror through the voices of intellectual movements in India or from Iran or from East Asia, from Africa, and without sounding overly nasty about it, sort of saying, no, if you'd been listening, here are the messages, here are the different sort of signs. And this book, The Age of Anger, I think offers us some insight into sort of thinking about some of those other signs going back well before the 1990s. And let me break that down just a little bit with an example. But the geographer Yi-Fu Tuan has argued that to live in the modern world, the world that we live in right now, is to be in perpetual tension, in a tug-of-war between the cosmos and the hearth. And I love that idea, that notion that we are all from somewhere, have a specific identity, a specific cultural home, but are invited to participate in this cosmopolitan world, which asks us in many ways to surrender much of that personal identity to be part of a global whole. And there's so much appeal about the global whole, but there's also something rather soothing about being from somewhere. We all are, in one way or another, hyphenated Canadians or North Americans or citizens of the world. The value or the potency of that hyphen changes depending on who and where you are from or what you look like and so on. But that notion of this tension between one's own heritage, one's own sense of community and values on the one hand, and a more sort of general and globalized sense of getting along and sharing is a powerful one. And this tension is what Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century referred to as the unfinished problem of civilization. How do we not lose sense of our own specific identities in a globalized, cosmopolitan kind of world? And there's a disorientation to this tension, but also the reality, a cold, hard truth, that cosmopolitanism as an ideal has never really been nearly as welcoming as its promise suggested. And this is, I think, one of the failures of liberalism. Pankaj Mishra, sorry, I sort of set this up poorly and awkwardly, in his book, uses the Enlightenment as this period of modernization and reason, and pits two of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire on one side and Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau on the other, as sort of serving as sort of the ciphers for this cosmopolitanism, which is Voltaire's mission and message, right? To open the markets, open up societies. We're going to create a globalized European world full of Western values. And Rousseau on the other, who became sort of the gutter snipe, who rejected that and opposed that and felt that it was important for us not to lose sight of this larger sort of globalized ideal that he thought was a sham, in place of recognizing the values and the merits of that more tribal, that more hearth-related kind of identity. Voltaire's notion of cosmopolitanism, as he pitched it across Europe in the 18th century, as he traveled to Russia regularly to praise Peter the Great and Catherine the Great in particular, who he thought were wonderful. Yes, they cracked a few eggs, but that's what the future requires. And their mission was to make Russians European. And subsequently then he enticed them to invade Poland and destroy the backward Poles so that they could be Europeans as well. Catherine the Great was also going to conquer the Turks. Voltaire had no time for Islam. He had no time for the Middle East. It was Europe, and this European value of cosmopolitanism was the original notion. But he was also, that's the negative side of Voltaire, right? And the negative side of cosmopolitanism is, I think we have to ask, well, what is cosmopolitanism in its initial design? And it was a very Western and a very selectively Western kind of notion. I think one could make the cynical argument that Voltaire was after acceptance for the intellectual elite, i.e. himself, within the established sort of hierarchy that existed within Europe. But he was also seeking the unifying thread within humanity. He was pushing for a more secular society, a more connected one, and for him it was the markets and the marketplaces that were going to do that. Voltaire, we remember for his writing. He's a beautiful writer, he's a persuasive writer, he's one of the foundational writers for the modern world today. He died one of the richest men in Europe, not because he was a great writer, although that helped, but he sold and made watches, and he found himself engaged in these new sort of global markets as well, and I think that's really kind of interesting. His opponent, intellectually but also in real life, they didn't like each other very much, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who rejected cosmopolitanism and its modernizing impulses. He was a proponent of the hearth, of tribalism, of recognizing the values, the connections associated with guilds and community and family. Those are the real connections. Those are the important connections. As Voltaire championed the destruction of Poland and turning the Poles into Europeans at the hands of Catherine the Great, Rousseau's famous line is, shouldn't the Poles have a chance to be Polish before they have to be European? And the suggestion that maybe they have an identity, maybe they might have some interest in being able to speak for themselves just a little bit. The book's better. Mishra's Age of Anger. But I hope, maybe this distinction between cosmopolitanism and tribalism, or between the cosmos and the hearth, helps to explain some of the radicalisms on the left and indeed the right. Those tribal differences cut across this traditional left-right axis. I think the other thing that Voltaire introduced, not directly, but we've drawn from him in this cosmopolitan world, is a political axis that runs from left to right, and oftentimes isn't able to make sense of the extreme left or the extreme right as being actually much more similar to each other than a straight line sort of left-right axis might perform. Yeah, it is more of a horseshoe, isn't it? And so I'm not going to draw on the walls, but you could imagine sort of an upside-down horseshoe, right? And on one side, far left, on one side, far right. And if you were to draw a horizontal line through that horseshoe, I think we could talk about cosmopolitanism being north of that line, and increased forms of tribalism or that adherence to the hearth or national identities down below. And those national identities, of course, are the rhetoric that have inspired and drawn fascisms and things like that as well, right? So that horseshoe, the upside down horseshoe, makes a lot more sense than that straight line left-right axis.
Actually, the horseshoe is about freedom and fascism. So there's authoritarianism, and the two horns on the bottom
Yep.
are the far right authoritarianism and the far left of the communist authoritarianism. And then you have the right of center, left of center on the top, which is the most freedom.
And I think, and so here the challenge is, and I think the criticism that Rousseau would make, I think you're right, I agree, but I think the argument Rousseau would make, and many people sort of below that line today would make, is that those freedoms north of that line are smoke and mirrors. They're based on the market, and that market may be free, but at the expense of people who are forced to the margins and outside of this. So it's not as, the premise is better than, and the promise is better and more inviting than the practice of. And I think that's where we get that tension.
Now I'm talking more about legal.
Oh, no, I understand. Yeah.
I'm not talking about
yeah.
the market.
Yeah.
Because there's economic slavery.
Right.
And there's what I would call government slavery, which is fascism on either side, or
Sure.
So there's more than one form of slavery.
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I want to be a little critical of this cosmopolitanism, because I think if we got it right, we wouldn't be living in the world we live in right now. And I think, if Pankaj Mishra is holding up a mirror, maybe we would do well to sort of think about how this matters, because I think this global civil war, or its combatants anyway, is the product of cosmopolitanism's unfulfilled promises. And not just the most impoverished, right? Cosmopolitanism was a clarion cry for Western modernization, taken up especially by the sons of the middle classes across Asia, Africa, and the global South. This incredible appeal of the Western European march to global dominance appealed greatly, not just within Europe, but to the elites and middle classes in these new conquered states. And how do our children, how do our sons, our daughters become integrated in this new promising westernizing and modernizing kind of world? And they sent their children to London, to Paris, to New York to receive Western education, to become integrated into this cosmopolitan elite. This westernization, according to the Iranian intellectual Jalal Ali-Ahmad, he called it Westoxification, not westernization, but Westoxification, came at a price. It meant relinquishing the hearth altogether, its identity and sense of belonging. This is Ataturk in Turkey getting rid of the fez. It's too backwards. It's from another period. We need to modernize. We need to be more like Europe. We need to cut the tether, cut the umbilical cord to our identity to become more westernized. Just one example of many. But
actually, the fez was also brought in by a more progressive sultan who felt the turban was too primitive.
And Ataturk took it one
so
step even further.
Said, okay, nobody wears turbans anymore. You're wearing the fez. So it was in itself a symbol of modernization, which is ironic that another modernist would want to abolish it because it was originally itself a modernizing symbol.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that's ironic.
There's nothing about history that's unironic. At the same time, of course, and we know how this story goes, these same sons were never fully recognized as members of this new cosmopolitan Western ideal. It turns out that the invitation to the club was largely reserved for Europeans. Yes, the membership was expanded, but not extensively, and it was never, and that was never part of the plan. Back to Voltaire's idea of what this cosmopolitanism was. This is an oversimplification, but one example of many, the Moroccan, this is in the spirit of your trip, the Moroccan novelist Driss Traibi, the 20th century novelist, has this, I think it's one of his first books, it's called Heirs to the Past, and it's the story of a son from Casablanca who's been in France. He left the family, he went to France, he studied in France, he's living in France, but his father dies, and he comes home for the funeral, and realizes that he's never really been fully included or accepted in Paris. But it's not until he comes home he realizes the extent to which all these ties to home and to hearth have been cut as well. And there's this beautiful passage where he talks he's almost exhorting the West that, you know, I came looking for you. I heard your promise. I came looking. I just wanted you to open your doors to me. Where are you? Show yourself to me. I'm ready to follow you, West. But of course, that never happens. And there's this tragic story of a young man, a young, skilled, educated man who is no longer part of either community and part of either world. And I think this might help to explain on some level the growing senses of ressentiment the world over. I think it might help to explain why Tunisia, the originator of the Arab Spring, was and arguably one of the most westernized among Muslim countries, was also among the highest exporters of jihadi fighters to Iraq and Syria. There's so many, it's not as though it's just the poorest of the poor eventually and occasionally rise up. It's actually a much more complicated algorithm that we might need to be attentive to. And I think it's precisely this notion of the promise of cosmopolitanism and the reality of cosmopolitanism leading to a radical and violent kind of disenfranchisement among a massive group of again, not exclusively, but predominantly young men from the global South. And of course, we're seeing that here and in the global North more and more as well. Now, lest this all seem to let Rousseau off the hook, he defended, as I said, against Poland against Voltaire's attacks. His nationalists and tribal sentiments inspired Ataturk on the one hand, who was an explicit hero to Hitler and to nationalisms. He was the father of German Romanticism, which sort of pushed back against this cosmopolitan ideal and a return to the folk and a return to these tribal elements, which are not in themselves, I would submit, violent or backward, but that's oftentimes the way they sort of manifest themselves in, if there's a global civil war, I want to suggest it's between the cosmos and the hearth. This is all broad and speculative. I'm happy to sort of talk about this in more detail after the break and things, but I should move on here as well because, and again, I've sort of said a couple of times, but not just men, more and more women we're seeing in the United States, across Europe, are gravitating towards traditional values and religious fundamentalisms, which offer clear parameters of purpose, responsibility, and belonging. And again, back to that notion of the hearth, I think when we see these turns to the far left, sorry, my left, far right, part of that is an appeal for a degree of order, an expression of order that they find that they're not finding in the larger cosmopolitan polis that we're sharing.
Is it order or community they're looking for?
I think they're looking for both, and they'll take either, but they're not finding it in the global marketplace. From where I sit, I think the world's getting angrier, not less angry. And we've more or less blown past, I think, any point of no return on resolving the climate crisis, which is its own problem, because it's only going to lead to more competition and more scarcities. And economic stabilities are becoming ever more aggravated. I am currently terrified by the prospect of what AI has to offer for us. I think the singularity, that the people who are convinced that the singularity will be a positive thing are exactly the same kinds of people who have the ear of Donald Trump right now, and that ought to be terrifying to all of us. And
Can you define the singularity? What do you mean by
so the singularity is this notion. It goes back to at least the 1990s, and I knew as soon as someone said define the singularity, I'm blanking on the name of sort of the primary thinker who's written a fair bit about this. I think if you just type in singularity, Kurzweil, thank you. The notion, the singularity is the point or the moment or the point where our machines will be smarter than we are. And we'll all be tapped into this cosmopolitan or globalized think space and turn ourselves over to the machines. I'm going to skip over some stuff. I'm running a little longer than I... No, well, I mean, do you really want to hear about the Iranian Revolution? No, we're good. My feeling is that the Enlightenment's legacy was the universal belief that human beings can alter their social conditions. I think Rousseau believed that. I also think Voltaire believed that. I think the idea, that premise that human beings can alter their social conditions, and we can think of that in the Enlightenment context of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or liberté, égalité, fraternité in France. In Canada, typically, of course, it's peace, order, and good government, but this notion of what constitutes and coheres a society, but that belief that we can alter our social conditions within those systems are also what brought us the Iranian Revolution and the backlash and violence there in the late 1970s. It's also the context that I think we could link Osama bin Laden and Donald Trump and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and every sort of global leader on either side of whatever spectrum you want to look at as being part of that same rhetoric and that same conversation. I think if there is a conversation back to Nietzsche's notion of the unfinished problem of civilization, that belief that we can alter our social condition remains that tension. But I said there was hope in the title. Right? Yeah, I did. I regret it now. That's all, folks. No, I can't finish like this. But it's difficult to be optimistic amidst the welter of these catastrophic times. But let's look for some hope. let me dilute it first by suggesting there's a difference between hope and optimism, right? The Irish poet laureate Seamus Heaney, and I think he got it from Václav Havel, has this beautiful distinction between hope and optimism. Optimism is the belief that everything's going to turn out fine. Hope isn't that. Hope is the belief that there are correct principles worth working towards. And so it was deliberate that it was hope and not optimism. I don't want to suggest that there is a way and we can afford to be optimistic, but I think we absolutely need to be hopeful, and that involves looking for the correct principles. Another book I would strongly, strongly recommend to you if you've not come across it is Leah Upi's book, Freedom. It's a story of her childhood in communist Albania. She was a teenager at the end of communism, and talking about sort of the change from communism to the aftermath in Albania. And she makes the same argument, not around hope and optimism, but around that notion of correct principles. The lesson of the 20th century writ large was that when the ends are put ahead of the means, we get authoritarianisms, we get totalitarianisms, we get solutions, but not necessarily the problems we had in the first place. And I think you could make an intelligent argument for communism or fascism as being a very sensible response. I would not agree with either one of them, but a very sensible response to the nature of the problems around us. And yes, we have to crack a few eggs, and yes, we have to be repressive, and yes, we have to be authoritarian, but that will get us to the kind of peace and order that that would stabilize our economies, our societies, and things like that. I don't subscribe to that. But that's putting the ends in front of the means. For Leah Upi, we have to put the means first. Her notion of hope is one that any hope for a moral world is based on making sure that we look for the correct principles, that we are putting the means first. The ends don't need to matter nearly as much as making sure that each step along the way is correct. And by correct, I think she means just and kind and peaceful and social first, rather than the individual. We need the foundation. The ends will sort themselves out. The Uruguayan writer who, if you're looking for some hope and just to calm your soul, Eduardo Galeano has this lovely notion that every time I take 2 steps towards utopia, it takes 2 steps back. So I take 2 more steps, and it takes 2 more steps. And the point isn't getting to utopia, but ensuring that I have the right direction in mind. And I love that notion. I think that's another way of talking about sort of having those correct principles first. So again, this is a way of impressing the importance of means over ends. We know what happens when we put the ends first, and that's the horrors of the 20th century and the authoritarianisms that came from it. But to sort of say we need the right principles without sort of offering what they are is a bit disingenuous. They need to begin with dignity, right? They need to begin with mutual respect and the importance of connection. So where do we look for hope? In the mid-1960s, Bob Dylan said that it was going to see Woody Guthrie in the Brooklyn State Hospital or in the Grand Canyon. Those were his 2 places for hope. Woody Guthrie is sadly long gone, and the Grand Canyon's in a country that I'm not comfortable visiting at the moment, so we need to look elsewhere. And let me finish then by asserting how much hope I have for the generation of young people we live with, we share our communities with, and the ones that I'll meet in class next week. It's very easy, and I understand it's a generational trope to sort of talk about kids today. But I have the incredible privilege of being able to walk into a classroom 2 or 3 days a week and meet with people 19 to 22, 23 years old. And I'm blown away by their hope, their commitment, their courage, and so on. So I started by saying I didn't really have very many answers. I still don't think I do. But let me frame this as what I take to be a correct principle. My father was a philosopher of education, so I'm in the family racket. I teach history at McMaster, and I sometimes worry that that's just a total lack of imagination on my part, that that's what my parents did, so that's what I'm going to do. But he was a very prominent philosopher of education, and I realized it was only after he died 2 or 3 years ago that I began to sort of make sense of what education meant to me beyond just a profession, a vocation, and so on. And he had a series of sort of principles that he gave to his students who were going to be teachers and working in education. The first one of which was believe in your students, in the value of their ideas, in their willingness to learn. Give them opportunities to also believe in themselves. And I want to suggest as a correct principle, not just in the classroom, but more broadly, this is the important lesson, is to give young people the opportunities to be more involved in looking for solutions here. In addition, Dad talked about there being no authentic wisdom without humility. Question your own beliefs, your ideas, your predispositions about the world. But then trust in your students, trust in your young people. Given the tenor of the talk today, I think they're living in incredibly precarious times. I admire, as I said, their courage, their commitment, their wit, and their kindness on a daily basis. I've got a class of 400 students I'll be seeing on Tuesday, and walking out of that room is exhausting after 2 hours of running around with 400 students. But the time in there is magical because they are there, and they're there for the right reasons, and they're there not because they are getting accreditation towards a degree that promises them entry into the middle class, which doesn't exist anymore, and job security, which doesn't exist anymore, but because they are invested in their education and making the world a better place. That seems to be the priority for so many of them, and I think that's really, really impressive. I trust in them. They are my hope. And I say that not just with the vested interest of having 3 children under the age of 30, and so they're part of this too. But they're also, I would submit, better positioned to identify and address the myriad troubles facing the world than those of us who are over 50. They understand, in a world that is increasingly disconnected, in a mediated and disconnected world, they're seeing connection differently than the connection that we might have grown up with and are experiencing or feeling as though we've lost it. They're experiencing different kinds of ways, and I think that they need to find greater sense of connection, but they also need a project. A new deal, if you like, with the freedom to work their imaginations in service of the world that they want to inhabit. And I worry deeply as real estate prices go up, rents go up, jobs become scarce, job security becomes even scarcer for the under 30, under 40 set in terms of their place within the world. We are seeing increasingly, not just in Canada, but around the world, so many of these people from these generations are not voting. They're not voting in Canada. They're not voting in the United States. They're leading to riots in Morocco. They're overthrowing governments in Madagascar.
Nepal.
And Nepal, yeah. I think this is an interesting moment, and that's not for me. Here's the hard part in this. Having said they need a project, they need a new deal. The hard part is we, those of us over 50, need to let them, and we need to get out of the way. That's not to serve as I'm not abdicating responsibility for the world that I'm leaving my children. That's not what I'm doing at all. But I'm learning to be a follower rather than a leader of. And every time I go into the classroom, it's not, this is my way. I'm very grateful for your rapt attention, by the way. It's very kind of you. This is not what I do in the classroom. It's not what I get in the classroom. I'm hearing and I'm learning from them so much that I think the difficult thing for the older generation has always been to sort of say, well, here's our experience, let's do this. Our experience isn't working. And I'm going into class on Tuesday and asking them to take the German and Romantic idea. Friedrich Schiller claimed that he believed that beauty had the power to change the world. And he was talking about not just aesthetics, he was talking about morality and all kinds of things. He had this larger notion of beauty. We're going into class on Tuesday, and in groups of 8 or 10, I'm asking them to put together beautiful blueprints, identify a world problem, and come up with a beautiful solution of one kind or another. I have no idea what it's going to look like because I can't think that way, but they can. Maybe not the best example, maybe not the best model, but the American poet Ezra Pound talks about the great tragedy of middle age is discovering that you were right at 17 to 23, and more right than you thought you were then. And I think that the cycle that we see regularly is that we don't let them be grown-ups until they're in their 30s or their 40s or their jobs, they're voting, and they've got their mortgages and the down payments, and they're caught up in a market cycle that means it's not possible for them to become world changers in the same kind of way. I think we need to get out of the way. The other key point that my father imbued to his students on this notion that beauty has the power to change the world is learning is one of the most beautiful capacities we have. And it's not something that happens only in our youth. I think it's something that is in university circles for marketing reasons, to get people like Muhammad to come back and take classes as in his retirement, is that we talk about lifelong learners. It's such a terrible cliche, but it's true. I mean, I think the more we are intellectually engaged, the more we are able to practice and flex our imaginations, the world becomes a kinder and more open-minded kind of place. But our youth are better at that than that. They have, I mean, you remember from your own youth, you have that sort of versatility and flexibility. The poet Charles Baudelaire has this lovely line about genius being the ability to recapture youth at will and being able to reimagine what it's like to be a child. And it's because of that curiosity, that imagination, that creativity that gets superseded by grown-up problems as we get older. So I want to suggest that it is our young people we should be following, not leading. I think we obviously have information and knowledge to share, but not at the expense of giving them the keys to thinking about a happier world. If learning is one of the most beautiful capacities we have, I really look forward to learning from you in a conversation and stuff going forward as well. But thank you very much for your time, for the invitation, for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Egan. We will have a break, 15 minutes, and we'll convene for Q&A, and we have an open discussion with Dr. Egan. Thank you.